Welcome to Reformed Thinking, the deep dive that takes complex source material, extracts the most essential nuggets of knowledge, and delivers them directly to you. Today, we are taking the historical step back. Way back 2 millennia. We're not just visiting the New Testament world in general, but specifically, we're going inside the ancient household, the domus.
Yeah.
Our mission is to really understand the social realities, the legal pressures, and the intimate structure of daily life for the women and children who would eventually become the first members of the earliest Christian house churches.
And that context is so vital. Our sources are pulling from, well, a huge stack of material. We're talking primary Greek and Latin texts, detailed legal documents, public art, which was often propaganda, really, and hard archaeological evidence. The whole point is to look past the idealized, polished monuments that Rome wanted everyone to see.
And get into the real world.
Exactly, to peer into the messy, complicated realities of the kitchens, the courtyards, and the slave quarters, where the majority of life actually happened.
And the goal for this deep dive is clear. We want to extract the structure and status of this ancient family unit to truly illuminate the New Testament's social setting. We're hunting for a constant, jarring tension that defined that world, the almost absolute value of the corporate family unit and its honor, standing in opposition to the often precarious vulnerability of the individuals who composed it, especially women and children. That tension shapes everything.
It really does.
So let's unpack this defining concept first, the domus. For us today, home suggests privacy, emotional intimacy, maybe a retreat from the world.
Yeah.
But in the Greco-Roman world, the domus was less a private sphere and more a corporate, economic, and political institution.
That's a crucial distinction to make right at the start. The entire value system of the ancient family centered on the community, the collective whole over the desires or status of the single person.
So it's the group first.
Always. The overriding goal was the preservation and, the increase of corporate honor and fortune. Within this framework, an individual's personal aspirations or happiness were often considered strictly secondary.
Less important than the family's social prestige.
Way less important. Everything was subordinated to that larger structure and its continuity across generations.
And when we talk about the domus, we have to stress how expansive that definition was. It wasn't just a nuclear family of parents and children.
Not at all. The sources confirm that the domus included a huge array of residents. It meant extended family adult siblings, cousins, and grandparents, often living under the same roof or in the same compound, all tied together by economics. But critically, it also included the entire staff and residents, the family's slaves, freedmen, and freedwomen. Every single person within that household had a specific ranked status, and that ranking determined their function and, well, their vulnerability.
This structure immediately brings the role of the father into sharp focus, along with this concept of paterfamilias. This figure held the highest social and legal standing.
He did. We can't discuss the ancient family without understanding the concept of patria potestas, which is the legal authority held by the father over his children and his property.
And it was extensive.
It was breathtakingly comprehensive. In theory, this power was absolute, often extending to the right to approve or deny marriages, to sell his children into slavery, or even the right of life and death over them.
Wow.
Though, that last one was heavily constrained by custom and public opinion, especially as you get into the later imperial periods.
Yet, scholarship notes a crucial distinction here. While paterfamilias seems to describe this absolute legal authority, the sources suggest that the term was predominantly used in legal documents.
Yeah.
Not so much in daily conversation.
Precisely. The term primarily reflected the legal running of an estate, not necessarily a loving relationship. A man could technically hold the status of paterfamilias, meaning he was the master of the household and property, even if he was unmarried or had no children of his own.
So it's a legal title more than a family role.
In many ways, yes. When describing the ideal father in a relational sense, the sources suggest he was characterized as beneficent. That means he used his immense patriarchal power specifically to aid and benefit the family, ensuring its welfare and survival, rather than simply exercising control arbitrarily.
So it's the distinction between legal status, the paterfamilias, and moral obligation, the beneficent father. What about the feminine counterpart, materfamilias?
That term conveyed social standing and virtue. It described a woman of, well, sterling character, modesty, and honor. The materfamilias was responsible for upholding the domestic honor of the entire household. She was the moral anchor, even if she lacked the legal power of her husband.
This high ideal brings us to the first major disconnect in the sources. The difference between the public ideal promoted by the state and the messy reality within the home. Public art and state propaganda they were pretty aggressive in promoting the elite Roman ideal.
Absolutely. If you look at imperial monuments, coins, official statuary, they often depict Roman elite fathers actively involved with their children's welfare, usually showing the father with his son or daughter.
Yeah, it was strategic.
Totally strategic. It symbolized the father's commitment to the future of Rome. They promoted this image of familial stability and engagement.
But those public images were also deployed politically to define who was not Roman, right?
Yes, they were manipulative. Non-Roman families, when they appeared in imperial art, for example, on triumphal arches commemorating a conquest, were often depicted only as a mother with her children.
The father's missing.
Pointedly, without the father present, and usually positioned in postures of submission or mourning. This was visual shorthand, used to categorize non-Romans as lacking the strong patriarchal foundation that supposedly defined Roman superiority.
But the private reality often contradicted the official ideal, even within elite Roman families. The sources reveal a fascinating blurring of status lines in daily life, especially concerning childcare.
It's pretty shocking, really. The sources note that free children often grew up in close proximity to the household staff. They frequently slept in the slave room alongside their wet nurse.
Really?
Yeah, and spent their play hours with the family's slave children. The social stratification was certainly there, but the spatial segregation we might expect was often quite flexible, forcing an unexpected intimacy across deep status divides within the very structure of the home.
That spatial flexibility seems to be key to understanding the Roman house. The spatial organization of the wealthy domus wasn't primarily divided by gender, it was divided by status and function.
That's a critical point for you to absorb. Public and private space was divided not to keep men separate from women, but to keep people of low status separate from high status interactions, or to conduct work. No rooms were strictly restricted purely to men or women, and slaves served in every area of the home.
This suggests the Roman home was a bustling economic and political center. The paterfamilias wasn't just resting there, he was running his career and his entire estate from the house.
Absolutely. The house, especially the dining room, the triclinium and adjacent chambers, was the primary place of business. The paterfamilias would invite peers of high status, almost exclusively men for serious business, to dine.
And this is where deals were made.
This is where high-stakes business contracts were struck, political alliances were cemented, and status was affirmed. Men did a great deal of their professional work right there, amidst the chaos of the household staff.
But the paterfamilias was also a powerful agent of business, wasn't she? She wasn't just, confined to the wool basket.
Far from it. The paterfamilias was actively involved in managing the household operations, which could be extensive. This oversight sometimes included large-scale commercial production of goods. For instance, looms might be located inside the house, overseen by the mistress, producing textiles for sale, making the home a factory of sorts.
And women often had independent economic standing, even beyond the household's joint ventures.
Correct. Women, especially in Rome, could be patronesses in their own right. They owned slaves and property independently, they had their own clients who owed them loyalty, and they managed substantial business concerns completely separate from their husbands. This evidence completely debunks the simplified notion that all ancient women lived in total seclusion.
We mentioned socializing earlier. There was a subtle but telling cultural contrast between Roman and Greek customs regarding dinner parties that shows how female visibility was managed.
This is a great detail from the sources. Roman custom included the paterfamilias at the evening dinner party, the convivium. While the event was heavily focused on male socializing and politicking, the wife was often present, symbolizing the family's joint honor.
Okay, so she was there.
But in traditional Greek homes, women of the family did not participate in the dinner party, the symposium, if unrelated men were present.
A very different expectation.
That difference speaks volumes about varied social expectations regarding female visibility and mixed company within the broader Greco-Roman world.
That's a powerful picture of a stratified, economically intense Roman domus. But we need to zoom in now on a specific cultural pocket relevant to the New Testament, the Jewish household context in Roman Palestine. Did their architecture reflect different social priorities?
It did, largely due to necessity and tradition. The most common Jewish house style was architecturally much simpler than the Roman elite villa. Typically a single-room structure with an adjacent courtyard, either in the front or back.
And they used the roof.
Critically, yes. They utilized the roof space heavily, accessed by an exterior staircase. This roof served as a critical functional and social space, especially in the heat.
And given the smaller size, where did the constant labor of the family happen?
It was all integrated, reinforcing that corporate identity. Most production activities, food prep, baking, grinding grain, sewing, carpentry for both men and women, took place either in the home's main multi-purpose room or, more commonly, in that adjacent courtyard. This architecture reinforces the notion of the family unit as an integrated, cooperative economic enterprise, where labor was constantly visible and shared.
All right, so let's shift from the physical structure to the legal and economic status of women. Let's talk about marriage.
Okay, marriage was central to social stability, and we have to note the significant age disparity. Women typically married first in their mid to late teens, while men usually delayed marriage until they were between 25 and 30.
That's a decade or more difference. So the man was usually economically and socially established, holding significant legal authority, while the wife was still essentially transitioning from childhood.
Precisely. Now, how was a marriage established? There was no state certificate, not like we think of it. Marriage was defined by the couple's agreement and public intention to live together as husband and wife.
So it was the intent that mattered.
Yes, but the legal and economic event was the dowry contract. This document wasn't just a record of goods, it was the entire official foundation of the union.
And the dowry contract was inextricably linked to the wife's legal status, specifically whether she remained under her father's power or transferred to her husband's authority.
That's where the key legal concept of the sign manu marriage comes in, literally, without hand. In this arrangement, the wife legally remained part of her father's family, even while living with her husband.
So she wasn't under her husband's legal control.
Not directly, no. This meant she was not transferred under her husband's direct legal authority, his manus. This arrangement gave women, especially elite women, much more freedom and legal agency over time.
Let's focus on the dowry itself, because it seems to be the economic guarantor of the marriage and of the wife's future security.
It was absolutely essential. The dowry was the capital the father provided to the husband to help support the marriage. The husband could invest it or spend it, make a profit. But here's the critical economic protection for the woman.
Okay.
If either party requested divorce, the husband was legally obligated to return the dowry principal. He could keep the profit or interest he gained, but the original capital had to be returned either to her family or to the wife herself if she was legally independent.
That requirement for the dowry's return must have given women and their fathers significant leverage in divorce proceedings.
It did, especially in elite circles. It acted as a financial check on arbitrary male behavior. It made divorce an expensive proposition for the husband, particularly if he was the one initiating it without a good reason.
And what if the wife died?
Well, if the wife died before her husband, her will often directed that the dowry be used specifically for the support and education of their children, cementing her continued economic influence even after her death.
Now let's look beyond the legal framework to the social ideals reinforced for women, which focused heavily on domesticity and virtue.
Right. The primary ideals were modesty, industry, and pietas, which is this idea of fidelity and loyalty to the family, the state, and the gods. This was frequently symbolized by the chaste matron working wool at the loom. You see this image everywhere, in inscriptions and epitaphs praising deceased wives for their domestic virtues.
But again, this ideal of seclusion gives a misleading impression of the daily lives of most women.
It is deeply misleading. While the elite promoted this idea of seclusion, the reality was that most women worked constantly. They were active shopkeepers, running stalls and businesses. They were hired out as wet nurses, a critical service. They studied philosophy. And we even have records of women serving as patronesses of various trade guilds.
And for most women, it was just about survival.
For the vast majority of women, yes, the reality was stark. They were poor and worked relentlessly, often outside the home, simply to ensure their children had food.
This brings us to the distinct challenges faced by slave women within the domus structure.
The sources make it clear that the life of a slave woman was uniquely compromised. Her sexual honor was, in the eyes of the law, non-existent. She was considered property. Moreover, many slave women lacked the marketable skills necessary to earn the money required for manumission or freedom. The image of the slave woman, the source material observes, often symbolized defeat and profound despair in that world.
Let's return to the dissolution of marriage. Divorce and widowhood. In modern contexts, divorce carries a lot of social baggage. did it in the Greco-Roman elite context?
It carried surprisingly little social stigma. The only time it was a real problem was if the grounds for divorce were adultery on the woman's part.
I see.
For elite families, divorce and remarriage were often pragmatic political tools used strategically to align the family to a better political or financial standing. If a more powerful alliance emerged, a marriage could be dissolved and a new one contracted with relative ease.
Did the rules governing sexual conduct apply equally to men and women?
They were notoriously asymmetrical. Wives were restricted exclusively to sexual intercourse with their husbands. A man, however, was charged with the crime of adultery only if his partner was another man's wife.
So it was a property crime.
It was a violation of the other man's property rights. His activities with single women, prostitutes, or slaves were not legally defined as adultery.
And what about widowhood? Did women commonly stay single?
Remaining unmarried, a univira, was certainly presented as a first-century AD ideal. It was seen as demonstrating perpetual honor and fidelity to the deceased husband.
But was it practical?
Not really. Practicality usually overruled idealism. Most widows, especially those of childbearing age who needed economic support and protection, remarried fairly quickly. We see this necessity reflected in the specific church instructions later on.
The state itself saw the production of children not just as a family goal, but as a political imperative. Augustus established laws to directly incentivize reproduction.
These were the famous Augustan laws, the Lex Julia and Lex Papia Poppaea. They were designed to increase the population of Roman citizens, and they tied a woman's reproductive capacity directly to her social and legal autonomy.
How so?
Specifically, Roman citizen wives who produced 3 children were granted the inistrium liberorum, the right of 3 children.
What did the right actually grant the mother?
The most critical benefit was freedom from the oversight of a legal guardian or tutor in her business and legal affairs. Without a tutor, she could manage her own property, make contracts, and conduct business independently. This was a massive gain in legal autonomy.
And for freed women?
Freed women required 4 children to achieve the same privilege, which shows the state's clear desire to integrate reproductive capacity into the legal structure of Roman society.
Let's consider the realities of motherhood and childcare itself. We know mortality was high, but what was the experience of childbirth?
Childbirth was incredibly dangerous for both the mother and the infant, impacting all social classes, especially young, first-time mothers. Deliveries were managed by midwives, often using a birthing stool. The sources reveal the pervasive anxiety surrounding every single birth.
And the choice of who nursed the child was often a marker of status, wasn't it?
Yes. Although certain moralists and philosophers argued for maternal nursing, praising the natural bond, many wealthy families opted out. They feared the physical strain it placed on the mother.
So they hired help.
Consequently, they often hired a wet nurse, a nutrix, or purchased a wet nurse slave. This was partially a status symbol, demonstrating the family's wealth and the leisure of the mother.
But this practice wasn't strictly limited to the elite, was it?
Surprisingly not. Evidence suggests that even low-status and poor families sometimes used wet nurses, perhaps influenced by the upper-class social standard or, more likely, out of economic necessity, particularly if the mother needed to return immediately to wage-earning labor.
So if a woman was wealthy, she was less involved in the daily, hands-on care of the infant.
That is the pattern. The earliest daily care, the feeding, the swaddling, the cleaning, was primarily handled by the hired nurses and later by the pedagogi. Wealthy mothers tended to focus their involvement on the child's later education.
When the child was older.
Right, once the child reached school age. They would focus on religious matters, philosophical virtues, and character development.
Yet they maintained significant influence over the child's future.
Absolutely. They were influential patronesses themselves, often using their personal dowry funds or inherited wealth to arrange favorable marriages for their children and to advance their sons' careers. They were also the primary teachers of domestic duties and the family's specific religious practices to their daughters.
Okay, we have to transition now to the most vulnerable members of the domus, the children. And the sources lay out 4 striking differences between the ancient experience and our modern sentimental notions of childhood. The first deals with how children were understood intellectually.
This is fundamental. There was a pronounced lack of developmental models. Ancient philosophers and pedagogues had little interest in viewing the world through a child's perspective or recognizing distinct stages of psychological growth.
So they were just seen as small adults.
In a way, yes. Children were primarily valued based on their capacity to contribute to the larger social whole. Age-appropriate behavior was determined strictly by physical maturity. Could they walk? Could they talk? Had they lost their baby teeth? And by their social class.
The second difference relates to who provided daily care, challenging our assumption of what constitutes parental attachment or compassion.
Because parents were frequently not the primary daily caregivers, relying heavily on slaves, nurses, and tutors, modern readers often jump to the conclusion that there was a general lack of emotional compassion.
But that's not necessarily true.
No. Scholarship suggests that employing a network of professional nurses, specialized educators, and pedagogy actually demonstrates genuine care, ensuring the child received the necessary instruction and supervision required for survival in a dangerous world.
And given the terrifying mortality statistics, that distance might have been a necessary survival mechanism for the parents.
Exactly. Given the constant threat of loss, this system of delegation may have created a necessary emotional distance. But more importantly, children were seen as belonging corporately to the extended family group, the gens critical for its continuity and economic viability, not just as the private, emotional possession of the biological parents.
The third difference is the overwhelming impact of wealth disparity on childhood experience.
The gulf between rich and poor was immense. There was effectively no stable middle class. The majority of children grew up either poor or living precariously at a subsistence level. The childhood experience of a child connected to Caesar's household.
Getting a private education,
Tutors, elaborate tutors, security that was wholly incomparable to the experience of a child born to tenant farmers in rural Italy or in a crowded, poor quarter of Alexandria. This difference determined everything about their development and future.
and the final difference paints a picture of extreme instability.
Life was fundamentally defined by social disruption and violence. The ancient world did not shield its youth. Public executions, gladiatorial combat, torture, these were commonplace spectacles, not restricted from children's viewing.
Just part of everyday life.
And moreover, beatings were widely accepted as normal practice in both schools and within the family. We simply cannot describe life in this period with words like stability or safety.
The sheer anxiety surrounding birth and infant mortality must have been immense.
It was constant. While some studies suggest a slight cultural preference for sons to carry on the family name, epitaphs commissioned by grieving parents demonstrate a similar heartfelt love and despair for lost daughters. But the raw statistics are truly heartbreaking.
What are we talking about?
30 to 35% of all newborns did not survive the first month of life. By age 10, a staggering 50% of all children had died.
Half of all children.
Half.
And the risk for the mother was also profoundly high.
Yes. Maternal death risk was estimated at 17 per thousand births, a number dramatically higher than today. Think about the implications. A woman who survived to the relatively short life expectancy of 50 would have likely given birth to 6 children, but statistically only 2 or 3 of those children would survive long enough to reach adulthood.
This high mortality makes the father's role immediately after birth profoundly significant.
It was literally life or death. It was the ultimate exercise of patria potestas. If the newborn appeared healthy and strong, the midwife presented the baby to the father. The key moment was the father's recognition. If he embraced the child laid before him, the child was formally accepted and raised in the home.
And if not,
If he rejected the child, the baby was put out. The practice of infanticide, often by expositio, leaving the child to die or be picked up by slave traders.
we should note the Jewish context here, which represented a moral exception to this widespread practice.
That is critical. The sources confirm that unlike their Greco-Roman neighbors, Jews did not practice infanticide. This difference must have set Jewish and later Christian households dramatically apart from the surrounding culture in terms of the immediate value placed on infant life.
Let's detail the early care practices for these fragile newborns. What was standard procedure?
Newborns were immediately swaddled tightly, which was thought to protect their soft bodies and ensure straight limbs. Surprisingly, sometimes they were not fed for up to 2 days, based on the prevalent medical belief that the baby needed rest to purge itself of residual fluids from the womb.
And the naming ceremonies varied significantly between Roman boys and girls.
They were important milestones marking corporate acceptance. Roman male children were named on the 9th day after birth, usually celebrated with a purification service involving the maternal aunt and uncle. Female babies were named slightly earlier, on the 8th day. A further celebration was common on the 40th day, marking another critical survival milestone.
When did they start introducing food other than breast milk? And how long were they swaddled?
Breast milk was the staple until about 5 months. Supplements often included cereal or bread moistened with milk, honey, or wine. Weaning usually occurred much later than today, averaging between 2 and 3 years of age. Given the perception of weak limbs, infants were frequently kept swaddled until as late as 2 years old.
And dietary deficiencies contributed significantly to that terrifying death rate, particularly for children under 5.
Yes. The diet of young children, especially the poor, often lacked sufficient protein and essential vitamins A and D. This directly weakened their immune systems and contributed heavily to the high mortality rate for children before they reached the age of 5.
Moving past infancy, when were children considered physically ready for formal schooling or training?
Around age 7. Once children began losing their baby teeth, they were considered physically ready. This was the practical marker for the transition into formal education or the commencement of serious trade learning.
And the descriptions of discipline during this training period are consistently severe. Why were beatings so widely accepted?
This was rooted in the ancient philosophical view of human development. Children were regarded as fundamentally irrational beings who were primarily driven by appetite and passion. Therefore, they required strong, even brutal, discipline beatings and corporal punishment to forcibly develop rationality and self-control.
They lacked our modern psychology.
They simply lacked the concept of developmental psychology. Childhood was seen as a social category defined by immaturity, not a psychological stage.
The pedagogus played a central yet complex role in this educational process.
The pedagogus was vital. He was typically a male household slave, often Greek, whose primary duty was to accompany the child to school. While he taught rudimentary academic lessons, his function was more broadly moral. He imparted critical lessons in character, demeanor, and guided the child's crucial socializing. He was essentially a moral shadow and protector.
The necessity of child labor demonstrates how quickly children were required to contribute to the corporate unit's survival.
Contribution began early, well before the teens. Children worked alongside adults. Free boys typically began apprenticeships for 2 to 3 years in trades like weaving, jewelry making, embalming, starting around ages 13 to 15.
And girls.
Free girls rarely left the parental house for apprenticeship. They learned their craft, usually textile production, at home from the women of the household.
And the physical costs of this early labor are visible in the archaeological record.
They are stark. Skeletal remains from sites across the empire show evidence that children as young as 7 years old already suffered upper body injuries resulting from repetitive motions.
From what kind of work?
Things that indicate heavy, sustained labor like rowing or manual farming tasks like repeated bending and lifting. Younger children were also critical for domestic labor. Table service, fetching goods, cleaning, watching animals, and caring for younger siblings.
Finally, we have to acknowledge the dark side of the ancient household, the inherent sexual vulnerability of the non-free members, which is critical for understanding the deep stratification of the domus.
This is a harsh reality of the time. Both male and female slaves, regardless of age, were considered chattel and were sexually available to their owners, who also had the legal right to prostitute them for profit. Pederasty, a sexual relationship between an older man and a young boy, was common and socially accepted practice.
But wasn't it a crime to violate a free boy?
Violating a free Roman boy was a recognized crime under the Lex Julia, yes. But the overall sexual landscape was intensely exploitative and profoundly dangerous for every vulnerable member of the household.
We have spent a significant amount of time detailing the status, structure, and severity of the Greco-Roman domus. Now let's execute the core mission of this deep dive, connecting this reality to the New Testament. How does this overwhelming context shape the way we read the Gospels and the epistles?
It completely revolutionizes the backdrop of familiar events. Start with the birth narratives. When we read about Elizabeth and Mary experiencing successful pregnancies and labors, we need to understand that they did so against a backdrop of intense, pervasive trepidation. In that world, successful childbirth was never guaranteed. It was a miraculous reprieve from mortal danger for both mother and child.
That makes the resulting celebration far more than a simple family milestone. It's an act of profound relief.
Absolutely. The acts of the circumcision and naming of John in Luke 1 and the dedication of Jesus in Luke 2 highlight the specific joy and social affirmation that accompanied a healthy baby who had successfully passed the high mortality hurdles of the first 8 to 40 days of life. That survival was a cause for genuine communal rejoicing because it meant the family unit had successfully overcome the greatest statistical threat they faced.
And the alarming statistics on early death provide the most critical background for Jesus' healing miracles concerning children.
They underscored the acute precariousness of life for every family. The accounts of the healing of Jairus' daughter, the resurrection of the widow's son at Nain, or the demon-possessed boy were not isolated events of sickness. They were linked directly to the fact that death was a constant, imminent, and overwhelming threat, especially to those under age 10.
So the parents' joy is that much more understandable.
The immense visceral joy expressed by the parents when their children were restored or raised becomes completely understandable only in the context of the 50% mortality rate. The restoration of a child was the restoration of the family's future economic and social viability.
This historical data also illuminates the foundational structure of the early church community. Widows and orphans were not an occasional demographic problem. They were an omnipresent structural feature of society.
The prevalence of death, both maternal and paternal, meant that widows and orphans were constantly present in the house churches. This is why we see the necessity for frequent, specific instructions regarding these groups. The local church became a new, stable kinship structure that the original domus could not guarantee due to fragility.
Can you elaborate on how the church addressed the instability the domus created for these groups?
Well, in the Greco-Roman world, a woman's security was tied either to her father's household or her husband's, secured by that returnable dowry. An unprotected widow or an orphan, especially without a surviving dowry or property, was legally and economically defenseless.
So the church stepped in.
The church's mandate to care for them, you see it in James 1.27, and the detailed instructions in 1 Timothy 5, that was a radical act of social redefinition. It established a spiritual kinship based on covenant belonging that superseded the kinship based on blood or legal status, providing the stability the world failed to offer them.
And finally, we arrive at the household codes found in the epistles, which address the profoundly stratified environment we've just detailed.
Paul's decision to teach in homes, as recorded in Acts 20, and the record of baptizing entire households, like the jailers in Acts 16, confirms that the gospel was addressed not just to individuals but to the entire social unit. This instruction had to be directed at a multi-status environment that included husbands, wives, masters, slaves, and children of all ages.
The codes in Ephesians 5 and 6 and Colossians 3 and 4 directly address the existing rigid structure of the domus, with its absolute authority of the paterfamilias and the stark divisions between free and enslaved. How radical were these instructions in that context?
They were stunningly countercultural. Look at the instructions to masters and slaves. The command for slaves to obey their masters was standard Roman expectation, but the command given to the masters to drop their threats and treat their slaves fairly.
Right.
Knowing that he who is both your master and theirs is in heaven, and there is no partiality with him, that was a direct assault on the fundamental structure of patria potestas. It placed the master and the slave on the same spiritual footing under a higher master.
It essentially chipped away at the absolute authority of the paterfamilias by introducing a co-equal status based on covenant, not on Roman law.
Exactly. When the epistles instruct husbands to love their wives as Christ loved the church, it demands a self-sacrificing, beneficent love that was completely antithetical to the husband's legal right to control or divorce for convenience. Similarly, the instruction to children to honor their parents, followed by the instruction for fathers not to provoke their children to anger, inserted a reciprocal, compassionate element into a relationship that was legally governed by the father's arbitrary power and the common use of beatings. These were mandates for radically different behavior within the existing social structure.
As we conclude this deep dive, we have moved through a complex arc of knowledge. We started by defining the Roman family unit's fierce focus on corporate honor, its expansive definition of the domus, and the immense legal power of the paterfamilias.
We then progressed through the legal and social framework for women, understanding how the dowry provided economic protection, how divorce was often political leverage, and the sheer necessity of external labor for the majority of women.
And critically, we absorbed the severe realities of ancient childhood, the absence of sentimental developmental models, the frequency of violence and discipline, and the terrifying mortality statistics that made the survival of every child a genuine relief and source of corporate joy.
Connecting this historical reality to the principles of faith, we have to see that when the New Testament speaks to the family and household, it speaks into a social setting where status determined every interaction, and children were seen primarily as material contributors to the group's survival. Recognizing the fragility of life and the stark social divisions within the domus helps clarify the deeply countercultural nature of the specific instructions given to early Christian households.
Given the extremely high value placed on corporate survival, and the low value placed on the individual's sentimental feelings in the Greco-Roman world, here is a final thought for you to carry forward. Consider how the early Christian instruction, which placed the spiritual care of the individual, whether child or slave, above the legal status of the domus, fundamentally challenged the social order. It was an instruction that sought to redefine kinship, making it an eternal bond of the covenant body, rather than a temporary structure built entirely on Roman law and material contribution.